Joining us. All right, I was waiting for that cue. Thanks everyone for joining us. I'm really excited about this session. This is a session on collective bargaining, wages, and inequality. I'm Ellora Derenoncourt. I'm at Princeton, and I'll just very quickly introduce our panelists and discussants. So we have Ihsaan Bassier, who will go first from UMass-Amherst, and will be discussed by Suresh Naidu from Columbia. After that, we'll have David Card from Berkeley presenting, discussed by Dube from UMass-Amherst. And then finally, a presentation by Lorenzo from Brown, discussed by Heather Sarsons from University of Chicago. And so without further ado, I'm gonna turn it over to Ihsaan. So just a quick note that presenters have roughly 25 to 30 minutes. If you err on 25, we'll have more time for discussion and questions. And then about 5 to 10 minutes of discussion and a couple minutes of audience questions. Thanks so much.
Ellora, can I just confirm that you can hear me and see my screen?
Yep, and I'll give you some time warnings as well.
Wonderful. Okay. Thanks so much, and I'm really excited to give this presentation. Very excited to be part of this panel. It's my first time presenting this work. It's on collective bargaining and spillovers in local labor markets. And just to introduce this, I mean, why here is that collective bargaining institutions are really, pervasive across the world. Just a quick look at the kind of ILO database of 85 countries, nearly a half, around 40 countries have over 30% coverage by collective bargaining or central bargaining institutions. And in the recent kind of years, there's been a lot of work that's happening at the same time on employer wage setting power, strategic interaction, and localization. Sorry, Ellora, can you just confirm that you can see my hand over here?
I can.
On the screen. Perfect. Okay, this one's to go back. Okay, so I mean, there's been a lot of work on these three features of imperfect competitive markets, and really what I'm trying to do here is to engage the collective bargaining institution directly with these kind of features that have been developed much more in the last few years. And some key questions that come out of that is, number one, that does collective bargaining reduce the potentially monopsonistic markdowns by just raising wages? It's a kind of first order question. And then a second question, which is really the focus of what I'm trying to explore in this paper, is this idea of, do these wage effects from the collective bargaining covered firms, the direct effects on the covered firms, do they spill over onto closed firms? And then thirdly, how do these constraints in a broader view of the labor market influence the structure of wages and jobs more generally? And the way I'm going to do this is looking at matched bargaining council agreements between 2008 and 2018, over a decade, in South Africa. So South Africa has a collective bargaining system with worker and firm level panel tax data. The main contributions, as I said, of this paper is to look carefully at the idea of spillovers, and specifically from institutional wage raises from collective bargaining. There's been a lot of work on spillovers, existence of spillovers, older work on looking at the effect of minimum wages, on looking at the shifts in the distribution, work in India, and of course, looking looking really well at firm level spillovers by Ellora, who's chairing the session, and others, and then the kind of classic paper by Steger, Spitz, and Phipps over a decade ago. here I'm looking at the institution of collective bargaining. And this might be of interest because, number one, it's really looking at collective bargaining affects a large proportion of workers. Here in South Africa, 40% of workers. But more generally, if we think about the spillover literature, it's often on specific firms or a specific group of workers, or in the case of minimum wages, looking at kind of lower wage or smaller firms, which is all extremely valuable, but it does mean that looking at collective bargaining more generally, and as I'll show later, workers that are on towards the upper middle part of the earnings distribution tells us something new. The second kind of angle at which I'm contributing to the literature is really identifying spillovers through worker flows. And this is really what I mean when I'm saying that I'm trying to get at local labor markets. So I'm going to be identifying, quite precisely where we expect these spillovers to go, which is firms that are most strongly connected by worker flows. And this is important on the one hand because of, it means that we're sure to exclude from the control firms. And so when looking at, for example, direct bargaining council effects to allow for no kind of SUTFA violations. But then on the other hand, also interpreting the actual spillover effects, it means that we can be sure that we're actually looking at these firms where we expect the highest spillovers. Whereas before, a lot of the literature looks at slightly cruder measures, such as industry by location cells, which isn't as precise. And then a final kind of contribution is just looking at the collective bargaining effects on covered firms. So it's the first comprehensive profile of the South African labor market as a whole with all collective bargaining councils. And then also I give some evidence on reallocation from these prescribed wage increases in the style of Dasman et al. Shown for Germany. Okay, so to head directly into the substantive part of this presentation, I'm really going to be starting off with a theoretical framework, then giving you some more background on the data and context of South African bargaining councils, then looking at the treatment effects of prescribed wages on bargaining council firms, treatment effects of prescribed wages on the spillover firms, and ending off with a discussion of aggregate effects, reallocation, and some heterogeneity. So the kind of theoretical model that I'm looking at is going to be combining the three features that I mentioned earlier: monopsonistic competition through preference heterogeneity, as well as strategic interaction. As I said, I'm also going to be looking at localized labor markets. And in this, I'm going to be incorporating aspects of search. So it's not just preference heterogeneity that's being incorporated here. And really, the localized labor markets are really in the style of outside options and local worker flows, with very similar, drawing on, for example, work by Cardoso and Harman and so on. I see there are some chat questions, which I'll probably only look at afterwards. Sorry. So then going directly into the kind of static part, and I'll head in one side onto the dynamic part of the model. The static logit, this is just kind of quite standard, nothing new here. The standard logit function, a value function depending on the wage, and in the kind of logit setup, we know that the probability that you're at this firm J is going to be a function of that wage, as well as of other wages. And in many other papers, the other wages are assumed to kind of into a constant term because firms are assumed to be kind of atomistic with no or little strategic interaction. And we're not going to make that assumption. We're going to allow for these wages to stay. And that gives a kind of firm labor supply elasticity, which also depends on your own firm share. It means that when you optimize profits, so kind of this is a kind of standard profit function with allowing for kind of decreasing returns flow. It means that the optimal wage ends up depending, on the firm labor supply elasticity and the productivity, but also on other wages in that labor market. And so you get a cross-wage elasticity that looks like this. And if you plug in kind of sort of reasonable values where we assume this, this firm K, which is raising its wages in my setup, kind of the collective bargaining firms, if they're kind of a substantial part of the market, you don't, they have an effect on firm J, where it doesn't really matter how big firm J is. Firm J's share can be really small, and this cross-wage elasticity isn't affected really much. And out of that, you get a substantial cross-wage elasticity of around 0.6 in this model. Of course, there's a lot of simplifying things. There's a lot of reasons we might expect very different magnitudes. But I mean, it's like a small test that seems good, basically. Out of this, we also get that this is looking for firm K. So this is not the cheated firm. This is the firm that's a spillover firm that's getting the spillovers. That firm faces a choice. Workers are attracted away from this firm towards the firm that actually has prescribed increases wages. And now it either keeps its wages and therefore it faces a decrease, it loses workers, or it can raise its own wages. And so there's a kind of wage employment locus that comes out of this. This is just a simulation. And the actual point at which the optimal kind of response of that spillover firm is really pinned down by that, as I showed before, by the optimal profits and the wage equation. And in this example, for example, the optimal response is to lose kind of 6% of wages and in employment and increase just over 3%. But it's a simulation. Okay, more onto the dynamic context. So that was almost static context. In the dynamic context, I'm drawing on forthcoming work by Cardoso, Dube, and Naidu, as well as Manning, recent paper, combining kind of preferences, search, and consideration sets. An idea here is that there are these idiosyncratic preferences from that kind of logit equation, redrawn every period, and then with probability lambda, your worker receives offers from surrounding firms, but those surrounding firms are part of a consideration set of connected firms. And so kind of this has all been pretty standard towards here. The only kind of innovation in this model is to really show that spillover effects are proportional, the expected spillover effects are proportional to the flows to the spillover firm. So if we look at a change in the wage of K, and here K is kind of, for example, the central bargaining firms, and we look at the change in employment for the spillover firm J, and remember there's a trade-off with wages, so wages also proportional to this, that is equal to a kind of recruits and quits. And we can see here, this is the a proportion of J's hires from K plus the proportion of J's quits to K. And so the average of that just gives the flows between J and K. And so this gives a kind of theoretical motivation for why we may look at the worker flows between these firms as the primary predictor of where we want to look for the spillover effects. And so that's the main kind of theoretical framing I want for the spillover effects, which I'll come to in about 5 minutes at time. So given that theoretical framework, I'm now going to move on to some context and descriptive data of the South African bargaining councils. Just to give you some background, because obviously not everyone will be familiar with that context. Here for the data collection process, I'm simply collecting agreements. There are 39 centralized bargaining councils, usually on the industry and location levels across the decade. I'm collecting those agreements, recording the wages and matching those wages to this data set of this tax data set that I have access to of matched employer-employee data. I'm matching at the level of a finely grained industry up to 4-digit industry, as well as location. So there are some sorts of errors. So the location and industry matching is not perfect, since, for example, in many bargaining council agreements, they don't actually use like the SIC code of the industry. And so there's a little bit of guesswork going on. also occupational differences. But this is overall the kind of first comprehensive profile of bargaining councils in South Africa. And just to give you an idea of what the South African landscape looks like, in green, I'm showing here bargaining council workers, and on the x-axis, I'm showing decile of firm mean earnings from lowest to highest. And this really emphasizes that, number one, bargaining council workers are kind of across the whole distribution. But number two, the bulk of them are really a lot in the upper middle part of the distribution. And that's, as I said earlier, quite different to, for example, those affected by minimum wage increases and for a national minimum wage increase and so on. Moving directly onto the treatment effects of prescribed wages on bargaining council firms. So these are the direct effects. We're going to get to spillover effects next. And the kind of econometric design I have in mind here is to look at an event, a stacked event study design, where the event definition is only looking at real wage increases above 3%. And in line with the stacked event study, I'm making sure that I'm having a clean pre-period of 3 years. That means that no large wage increases within that pre-period of 3 years. And also a post-period of at least 3 years. I am admitting wage increases within the second 3 years. And overall, this means that 2018 is my full period, but I'm allowing actual events between 2011 and 2016. My primary sample is at the firm level of balanced firms with at least 10 workers in each firm. In the pre-period, I show a lot of robustness, relaxing each of these. And overall, this gives 50 events with around 50,000 bargaining council firms. The main restriction, decreasing number of bargaining council firms is that I'm only allowing for these greater than 10 workers in pre-period. So just to give you an idea of what kind of wage increases this is admitting, the real wage increases that are prescribed are across a wide range. This is almost none of them are nominally negative, but in real terms, many of them are negative. In real terms, a lot of them are focused on exactly CPI, or very commonly in bargaining council terms, CPI plus 1 or 2. But I'm focusing on the green here, which is really looking at 3 and upwards. And the main specification for bargaining council firms I'm looking at is this over here. It's kind of a standard event study specification. So dummies or treated firms in the bargaining council. That's the pre-period, that's the post-period. I'm allowing for fixed effects per firm, as well as for events by location, by time. Also making similar comparisons across firm size, wage, and growth, and so on. The identification kind of experiment that we should have in mind is that we're comparing bargaining council firms to other firms within the same location. And these firms have similar firm size and wage or employment growth, and netting out firm level differences. So to rephrase that identification assumption is that without treatment, these bargaining council firms would have similar change in outcomes across time to these other firms, which are in the non-treatment, that are in the control, that I'm restricting to make sure that they're in the same location and similar firm size and wage and employment growth. Very importantly, I'm making sure to exclude potential spillover firms. I'll define spillover firms later, but it's as I theoretically defined earlier, and I classify at the industry and location level. Right, to the main kind of results on the direct effects. The average firm wages increased by 3 to 4% from these prescribed wages. And on top of that, within firm wages compressed. So you can see here quite flat pre-period changes in median wages. And we see a sharp increase in the post-period at around 3 to 4%. These increases, this gives across the x-axis here, just the post-period effects across the wage percentiles. And this is really showing that the lowest wage percentiles are getting the highest increases. The highest wage percentiles are getting increases, but they're getting lower wage increases, which overall means wage compression across the firm. And very importantly and interestingly, if I don't exclude the spillover firms, I allow for the SIFA violations, then if I include the spillover firms in the control, then these effects are actually, these wage effects are 0.5% lower. And so we can really see almost directly these spillovers on. Other effects on bargaining council firms, the wage increases are higher in mid-wage firms and in mid-sized firms. The mid-wage firms up to 5 to 8%, so substantially larger if we look at heterogeneity. And then if we look at flow effects on bargaining council firms, there's a kind of decrease in worker separation, but an unclear effect on firm size. And we can see, I'll talk to reallocation later, where this is different by value added. I can also show that this kind of stable pre-period effects on value added and profit per worker, which really addresses to some extent any concerns about endogenous wage bargaining and wage effects. Okay, onto these prescribed the effects of prescribed wages on the spillover firm. So these are prescribed effects on bargaining council firms that are then being tracked and tracking them onto spillover firms. And so the main specification
this is your approximate 5-minute warning.
Perfect. Thank you. The main specification is very similar, except the regressive set of dummies is looking at that flow, that average flow, that flow are between the bargaining council and the firm under consideration, the firm J. And that's exactly what I was talking to earlier from the model. And so, intuitively, this compares firms with high flows to the collective bargaining council to firms with low flows that are otherwise similar. And within each event, so this is a stacked event study design, and for each event or increase, I'm identifying these spillovers, identifying the set of firms that are in this regression. I'm making sure to exclude firms in the same industry as the actual bargaining council, just to avoid measurement error, and also making sure to exclude non-treated firms with flows to other bargaining councils, so that we're kind of getting a clean experiment here. Just to give you a little bit more of a description of what these spillover firms workers look like. If we think about the green, remember that's from earlier, that's still the workers in the bargaining councils. They're concentrated in the upper middle part of the distribution. The purple now gives the workers in the spillover firms. And I'm showing, and you can see here that they're much more evenly concentrated. They're certainly not concentrated at the top, almost mechanically. And there's a lot of them at the bottom of the earnings distribution. So this already gives you an idea of the kind of labor market inequality effects that these spillover effects could be having. And so onto the main results was the wage effect on high spillover firms is around 2 to 4%. So if you look at the kind of stable pre-period effects and post-period, it goes up to 2 to 4%. Again, within firm quantiles, the effects are highest at the top of the firm wage within firms, and lowest at the bottom. That implies some kind of compression of firm wages. Also, similar wage effects across the firm distribution. And if you look at, for example, UI co-payments, and then to look at the size effects on the spillover firms. What I'm seeing here is that it's more suggestive of a decrease in firm size for spillovers. And on top of that, profits do seem to decrease as expected from the model, where kind of your profits are staying the same, but you're forced to increase your wages while facing a trade-off against losing workers, rather than the bargaining council, which are at least offsetting that profit loss with an increase in workers in a monopsonistic model. Okay, so onto the final part, I think about 3 minutes left or something. Discussion of aggregate effects. And so this is a kind of simulation takeaway of how we can think about the direct bargaining council effects plus the spillover effects on the whole labor market. So if I just think about 2008 to 2018, looking at the central bargaining council agreements, prescribed real wages on average in bargaining councils rose by around 15%. In the same period, median wages across the rest of the kind of non-treated part of the data set were pretty stable. And so we can really think about an average, if we use it as a simulation, and we compare at the average effect on the total labor market, so all workers. The blue shows that average wage levels just from the bargaining council prescribed wage increases, is about 5% increase in average wages. If we include, as I've argued, the kind of causal spillover effects, this rises from around 5% to more than double, 12 to 14%. And of course, very importantly, it's affecting different types of workers. As I showed earlier, these are workers lower on the distribution, for example. And so if I look at, for example, the variance in log wages, actually including only the bargaining council effects increases inequality, the wage variance of inequality across the labor market slightly. And then, but accounting for the spillovers, then decreases a bit below actually the original, slightly below the original wage variance of the labor market in the kind of no effect counterfactual. The last thing I want to show is that this kind of reallocation. So over here, I'm looking at bin deciles of value added within bargaining council firms. And this is really showing that the lowest bargaining council firms are actually seeing kind of suggestively a decrease in workers, whereas the highest bargaining council firms are seeing a kind of suggestive increase in workers, which is, consistent with the kind of results given by Dasman et al. For Germany, showing reallocation from their minimum wage increases here in the context of collective bargaining. I'm not going to go into robustness and heterogeneity. I just want to wrap up and end off here by saying that in this paper, I'm really trying to think about collective bargaining, but also the broader effects of collective bargaining. It's an institution that's pervasive. It's an institution that governs the rules for more than half of workers across many local labor markets. And so we expect the kind of really a sea change in how we think about the labor markets. So yes, there's these direct effects that I find with sharp effects on bargaining council firms, but I also find these cross-wage spillover elasticities, which is pretty high compared to the rest of the elasticity of around, compared to the rest of the literature of around 0.8. I'm theoretically and empirically linking these spillovers to a mechanism of worker flows, and I'm leveraging the data to get these precise local effects, which really explains the kind of higher cross-wage elasticity compared to the literature. I think the literature is often 0.3, 0.4, 0.2. Here I'm getting 0.8. And I'm showing showing event studies that the wage increases are proportional to the localness of firms with precise effects and also these decreases in profits. And finally, these spillovers should really be thought of as a kind of proxy for like the kind of larger effects and on the wage structure on jobs that these bargaining councils have. And one indication of that is this kind of simulation I ended off with, that the kind of accounting for the spillovers has kind of makes the effect on the labor market structure much larger, kind of doubles the effect of these prescribed wage increases. And we can think of those effects through several complementary mechanisms, worker flows as I've modeled directly in my theory section, but also we can think of in a complementary way, norms of fairness, union effects, and so on. Okay, thank you so much for listening.
Awesome, thanks, Ihsaan. So now we'll have Suresh Naidu up. Can you share your screen and take it from there? Thanks.
Okay, thanks a lot. So it's a pleasure to discuss this paper and think about this. So, I mean, I just think there's a lot. Yeah, I think anyway, there's a lot going on in the data that I think is just kind of amazing. I think this is like the first, like I've seen at least, of like this administrative South African matched worker firm data, and it just opens up a whole set of questions that you can start thinking about, and it's kind of really great. So just to summarize the paper, the paper uses this timing of these bargaining council renegotiations to identify direct and spillover effects of sectoral I'll call it something like sectoral bargaining, the bargaining councils on wages in South Africa, and the there's a rich source of data in South Africa of like both the individual worker dynamics, but also linked to firm balance sheets. And that's in Canada. That's hard to get. That's only recently has come out in the US. It's really interesting. And by having this, Ihsaan can directly look at poaching and reallocation effects of wage increases experienced by covered firms, and then you can look at the mechanism of spillovers is looking at heterogeneity by time invariant average flows between the sort of non-covered firms and the covered firms. And the results are this large wage effects on covered firms with significant spillovers onto firms, onto those firms that have large flows to covered firms. And so the evidence, I think, for imperfect competition as the mechanism here sort of comes from their separation rates falling at the at the treated firms, but also in the spillover firms, and also profits sort of falling at both sets of firms. And that's sort of suggestive that you're walking up a labor supply curve, and it's coming at the and it's coming out of firm profits. Okay, so what I want to sort of, I don't know if you don't need to do this in this paper, but you might sort of think about it, is it's the nature of labor market institutions in developing countries is that they generally only cover the formal sector, and as you know, there's a very large informal sector that's often not covered by formal labor market institutions. And what's useful about the South African context is that this bargaining council is kind of generating variation in coverage within the formal sector, and so you can kind of get a sense of like what the spillovers might look like, just kind of to the economy more broadly. And so I think that's maybe one angle for thinking of in depth at the nature of spillovers across a variety of developing country labor market contexts, where you really do only have like the high value added formal sector firms that are covered by institutions, and thinking about the propagation of that to the uncovered part of the labor market. And so this paper focuses on labor market competition, totally legit thing to focus on. But I was sort of wondering, again, given the data, and maybe you don't do this in this paper, but maybe it comes up as something that some referee asks you to think about how to handle other types of spillovers. And so one is just like the other inputs of the other firm. So it's just like you wind up only defining the spillovers based on shared labor market flows, but you could imagine there's other types of ties between the uncovered firms and the covered firms that you might at least want to think about controlling for, and maybe they're interesting in and of themselves. So inputs, I think the fact that you see investment, I mean, that you should look at that. That's like a you look at profits, but I would actually just look at investment and exits as of the firms. And then I was like, oh, well, you have the input output matrix. So you could also think about defining ties to supply to like firms that are in industries that are like downstream and upstream in the input output matrix as another sort of definition of tie. Also, you could think of these firms as sort of possibly existing in product market competition space. And so you might want to try a specification where you only look at tradables to kind of like make sure that there's not like spillovers and non-tradables happening here. And then I sort of think there's two other things that you gesture at, but actually I think you could if you're willing to do the work, like look at directly, or at least somewhat directly, and the worker norms, information, and expectations, which is like these lighthouse effects that you bargaining council passes this wage, and now everybody looks at it and thinks, okay, that's now the standard. And then also I think like diffusion of management conduct is also interesting. So how do managers sort of like in the uncovered firms think about how to change their wage policies in response to the sectoral agreement. And so, any hope of disentangling. And I think on the last two, I think you can actually leverage the network that you have. So people sort of, you're thinking about it as this firm to firm network, but the underlying network is this bipartite network of firms and workers with like an edge given by the probability of employment. And so you can think about projecting that network along the firm dimension like you do, but you can also think about projecting that along the worker dimension where you're kind of getting different sets of coworkers. And so the firm network reveals, likely poaching, but the worker network reveals likely coworker. And so that gives you a way to sort of look at the sharing of norms, like in the Caldwell and Harmon paper, where you could imagine thinking about workers with shared coworker histories being another mechanism of like the spillovers here outside of the labor market, but the fact that you previously worked with a bunch of workers that are now experiencing this wage increase, but they're like not in the same labor market at all. Sort of like being a mechanism for those workers to think about their reference point, like what do they expect in the labor market changing. And then I think what would also be sort of interesting would be, because I think you have occupation in the data, maybe you don't, but is to look at management spillovers and also sort of forming the co-worker, the shared manager histories, so that you can imagine there's like a network of sort of relatively high wage, high within firm decile workers that have all kind of like, worked together or worked in the same firm. And there's like a way in which like management practices and management wage policies are also percolating across the firm network, so that when when the bargaining council changes wages, that actually propagates through a manager network to other firms, and again, like not in the same labor market. So that's just like some ideas for thinking about disentangling the other sort of possible margins of spillovers in here. The other sort of big point I want to make is, like I make on all papers about labor market institutions, is just that
2-minute warning, Suresh.
I'm good. And is to handle the informal sector. And I feel like I don't need to tell you this, but like the South African unemployment rate is like greater than 30%, and it seems really hard to ignore this very large bulk of workers. And so I thought like a natural outcome to look at is the share of recruits from non-employment, which you could definitely construct here. And that's at least one sort of sense of like, how is the incidence of these shocks getting at least transmitted to those workers that are coming from non-employment. And I wasn't sure, I feel like we talked about this, but I don't remember the answer, is that if the tax data has location of the workers, one really interesting thing to like capture the South African context is to think of the share of the recruits from the townships. And so that, spatial mismatch is kind of a often like proposed mechanism for like large unemployment in South Africa, that like all the big productive firms are really, really far away from where the poor workers are. And so I wonder if you looked at share of recruits from townships, that would be actually kind of an interesting way to think about how the formal sector is again propagating things into the informal sector. And then my last point is, I'll ask this about every paper on this kind of like on labor market institutions in developing countries. It's just like, who is actually at the table in setting the wages, and whose interests are they representing, and both on the employer side and on the union side, and how encompassing are the unions in a given bargaining council. So I feel like the South African unions are encompassing for the formal sector, but don't necessarily seem obviously concerned about unemployment, at least uniformly, across the different, and I think this varies across the different union federations, and that's an interesting thing to think of. They're like different, the different unions with their different federations as having kind of different interests in how they set the wages vis-a-vis firms. And you can imagine that depending on the extent of representation of workers, that the spillovers onto the uncovered sector are different because of the different degree of internalization of those interests. And so my last point, and this is like related to Lorenzo's paper also, which I think your paper is also very related to, is that now I think we have a couple of papers to suggesting that we're getting these upward sloping labor supply curves even in bargained wage environments, which is just why are they leaving money on the table when you have like presumably both workers and the union have an interest in getting all the way up the labor supply curve to and so what's going on that we still have upward sloping labor supply curves even in bargained wage environments? So what's the constraint that's preventing the union from kind of going all the way up to the efficient outcome? And that's it.
Awesome. Thanks, Suresh. So fantastic paper and discussion. Next up, and also feel free to use the chat to ask any questions and continue the conversation on the first paper. Next up, we have David Card, and I'll let you take it away. Thanks.
Okay. How's that? Okay, all right. Well, thanks very much for including our paper. This is work with Ana Cardoso. We're looking at collective bargaining arrangements in Portugal. So it's a European setting rather than an American setting. And as probably people know who know anything at all about collective bargaining in Europe, unions in Europe don't set an individual wage for a job like they do in the UAW contract with General Motors. They set a set of wage floors for different groups of occupations. And that means that there's, in most cases, some additional component of wages above the wage, the mandated wage floor for your job. And we're going to call that the wage cushion. And that's a term that Ana developed some years ago in a paper with Pedro Portugal. And so what we're going to try and do in this paper is sort of characterize how wages are evolving in response to adjustments to the set of sectoral bargains. So in particular, we're going to look at 4 questions, which are probably relevant, at least in some other European countries, not necessarily all of them. So the first question is, how do floors and cushions vary across workers? So this is just a very simple descriptive analysis, looking at decomposing the components of wages. And we're going to show that, of course, those are they all vary and are fairly important. Then we're going to go to contract level analysis. So we managed to put together a data set where we merged the collective bargaining agreements, which are recorded and published every year, into the worker firm database, the so-called QP database. And so we're going to try and look at the contract level analysis, and we've assigned every worker to what position they are in the grid of floors, wage floors for their collective bargain. And we're going to ask when a collective bargain is renegotiated. Now, collective bargains in Portugal don't cover a single firm in most cases. Most of them cover a sector. So it would be like the taxi drivers in Lisbon would be an example, or restaurant workers in the southern part of the country, below Lisbon down to the Mediterranean. So how do those floors adjust when there's a renegotiation? Basically, we're going to show that all the floors move together, which is reassuring, I think, for people that have ever studied collective bargains. In the data that we had available in Canada and the United States, we always just assumed that. So we actually are able to show that here. And then we're going to ask a slightly different question, which is something that kind of comes out of an old institutional idea. How do the firms that are in this collective bargaining agreement, so there's a bunch of firms on one side against a bunch of unions on the other side, how does the distribution of productivity changes at those firms affect the outcome? We're going to show that basically it's driven by what appears to be sort of the mean level of productivity in the industry. Then we're going to go to a more causal question, and probably this is the most important question in the paper, which is, when your floor is adjusted upward, does your cushion stay constant, or does your cushion adjust down? And we're going to show that, in fact, there is significant reaction of cushions to floor increases, and that's offsetting, in most cases, some of the increase in wages that would be predicted if you just looked at the floor increases. And then finally, we're going to do a descriptive analysis, not unlike the analysis that Ihsaan just did. We're looking at how what was driving wage adjustments between 2010 and 2018 in Portugal. This was a period of very difficult economic times in Portugal. They basically were temporarily under the control of a troika of the IMF and the central bank in Europe and so on. Okay, so here's the institutional setting. Firms are grouped into employer associations. you don't necessarily have to belong to an employer association, but most do. Can be forced by the government to join or be covered by an employer association. And in the 2010 period, when there was a troika took over, the the German economic guys who were trying to take over the Portuguese economy tried to get rid of this part of the agreement situation, but that didn't happen. About 10% of workers are not covered by these collective bargaining agreements, and on average, these are highly skilled, highly educated workers in professional services sectors. So the union non-union wage difference in Portugal is the non-union wage is higher. Most firms are very small, so that's probably one of the reasons why this thing has persisted, this arrangement. Nearly all wage clauses go for a year, but lots of times, especially in the period we're covering, wages were not increased. So you'd see for 2 years in a row or even 3 years in a row, there was no increase in floors. And the collective bargaining floor remains in place until it's renegotiated. So we've got 3 data sources. We've got the linked employer-employee data from QP, which is fairly rich, but we only see a snapshot every fall in October of individuals. So we don't know what you've done in the intervening period. We don't know like how many weeks you worked or anything like that. We keep full-time workers 18 to 64. A database has been now merged by the Central Statistical Agency in Portugal. They've merged the firm income statement and balance sheets. And the earlier work that Anna and I did with Pat Klein, we actually merged that ourselves, but they're now merging it for us. So that gives us value added and other information from almost all firms. And then we've merged in this collective bargaining agreements. Now we can't merge everybody because the collective bargaining agreements are basically just PDFs of the actual agreements. And we had a lot of research assistants and Anna's 2 nephews working for many months, merging these things by hand. It was a giant pain in the butt, but more or less got something like 55% of people merged, and we're very conservative. So we don't merge if we don't know who you're covered by. So here's a simple decomposition. At the top of this slide, we've got the total wage in levels, and that's going to consist of a floor, a cushion, and supplements. And the supplements are actually fairly important in Portugal because they're not taxed. So almost everybody gets a couple of euros for lunch every day, and a few euros for other things. Almost like something from the 1940s, which it more or less is. In logs, which is mainly going to work with, and you get to the bottom equations in this slide. So we've got you can write the log wage as a combination of the log of the minimum wage, which is fairly important in Portugal. The log of the ratio of your wage floor to the minimum wage, which we're going to call the relative floor, or I'm going to just call the floor. Okay. Then the log of the ratio of your base wage, which is the wage excluding these supplements, to the floor. And that's what we're calling the cushion. So it's the log gap between the base wage and the cushion, and then the log of the supplement over the base wage. And that's what we're going to call the supplement. Okay, so here's some basic descriptive analysis. Left panel females, right panel males, period 2008 to 2016. And I'm showing the 3 components of wages and log points. And remember, everything is judged relative to the minimum wage. So for example, females in 2016, the typical wage cushion is around 12 log points. The supplements are around 13 or 14 log points. And the floor relative to the minimum wage is around 16 or 17 log points. So a typical person is earning those 3 things summed together to give the wage gap above the minimum wage. And you can see that the floors are declining over time relative to the minimum wage. Remember, this is the floor relative to the minimum. And that is a combination of floors not adjusting with inflation and the minimum wage actually incrementing a couple of times, particularly in 2008, and then again in 2014. Here's the components by education. And as you probably would expect, there's kind of the usual pattern you'd think. So all 3 components are smaller for less educated workers. The group of people without a high school education is by far the majority of older workers in Portugal. Portugal is a very poorly educated country until 2 weeks ago. So there's a very, very large fraction of people who didn't even finish high school. For high school educated workers and university educated workers, these components are bigger. For university educated workers, they are quite large, relatively speaking, but they're also falling very quickly. And so if you know anybody who's got university educated children, or you're a relatively young person from Portugal, this is and you know, in this room, this is something you're very aware of, which is real wages of university educated people are falling like crazy. There's a distribution of the wage cushions for women and men. So there's a spike at 0 or close to 0, 1 or 2 percentage points. There's a very small fraction of people that got a negative cushion for reasons that I'm not going to go into. And then there's a long upper tail. And of course, as you would expect, it's the distribution of cushions is more compressed for women relative to men's. It looks almost like a minimum wage relative to the minimum wage. Here's the distribution of relative wage floors. And that also looks kind of the same. There's a spike very close to 0, and then there's a long tail. Okay, so if you just do a simple descriptive analysis, you'd see, looking at the top here, for all workers in the economy, the mean log wage, this is the log of the monthly wage. Everybody's paid by the month in Portugal, and we're looking at full-time workers. So the mean log wage is 6.84. And the components of that relative to the minimum wage, on average, 24 log points are the wage floor above the minimum, 19 log points are the mean cushion, and 17 are the supplements. And so here's their shares: 40% is the floor, 31% is the cushion, and about 30% is the supplements. By gender, here's the characteristics. And if you just do a decomposition of gender gap, given the pictures I've shown, about 30% of the gender gap, which is 16 log points, not too different than you'd see in the United States, is due to the differences in wage floors. About 9 log points, or 60%, is due to wage cushions, and 2%, a small bit, due to the floors. And there's, in our paper, there's a lot more of those kind of discussion. We also show how these different components affect the variance of wages, but in the interest of time, I'm going to blast ahead. So the first, sort of the next causal question we're going to look at is, how do you describe the distribution of wage floor changes? So C is the collective bargaining group, collective bargain, excuse me. G is the group of the wage floor indicator. So a typical collective bargain might have between 10 and 25 wage floors, and T is time. So this is bargaining level data. Okay, and equation A here is a very simple model that said, okay, if we look at the change in those floors and just have a year effect, what do we get? And the second model is we have a change in the collective bargain C, wage floor G, period T. We can decompose that into a CT dummy. So that would, model C says, okay, collective bargains can be a little different amongst each other, but all the floors in a given agreement increase the same. We call number A the Swedish model, because in somebody's vision of the way collective bargaining is supposed to work, that's often thought of by old-fashioned Europeans as the optimal model for the economy. We're all supposed to lower our wages. You know, this is based on the idea that everyone's wages are too high and we all need to lower our wages together. If you look at the fit of those models, about almost 80% of the variance of wage floor changes is described by just year effects. So there's a pretty big year component. But 98% is explained by collective bargaining effects. So basically, there is some variation across agreements in the degree of negotiation, but within an agreement, all the floors move together. So a fully centralized model is not that bad, but basically a contract level model is quite good. Okay. Next question we're going to ask is, how does this change in the average increase in floors when a contract is renegotiated, how is that related to what's going on the firm side? So we're going to estimate a model where we take the average change in the percentage change in the wage floor when a contract is renegotiated, and we relate it to a bunch of distributional characteristics of the change in value added for all the firms in that agreement. And we were interested in the question, so there's sort of a suspicion in the old-fashioned literature that the better performing firms kind of force up wages and drive their competitors into bankruptcy. That was alleged to have happened when the UAW negotiated Studebaker out of business, for instance. Here's what this table shows the results of that analysis. The top row shows the coefficient on different types, measures of value-added statistics. So the first column is the mean change in value added across all the firms covered by the agreement. Then the different percentiles. Column 4 is the median. So the median and the mean are not too different. A coefficient of around 0.065, which is, you could think about that as some measure of a rent sharing type of equation. We're showing that very similar to models that were fit 1,000 years ago by John Aboud and Tom Lemieux using Canadian wage contract data. They didn't have these distributional things, but they would have gotten coefficients a little bigger than that, but sort of similar. There's a few other characteristics of the collective bargain group of workers that are covered by that bargain that also matter. So bargains that have more women, their wages are going up a little bit relative to other bargains. Bargains that are covering more university grads are going down. Okay, and just to sort of see what was going on in the longer term picture, we took data from beginning and end of our sample, and we looked at the change in the collective bargain floor for each agreement from the first period we see it being established in our sample to the last period. So in most cases, that's going to be a combination of 3 or 4 renegotiations. And we look at the change in the real value added statistics for the covered sector of firms. And these coefficients are a little bigger, which you might expect given the usual finding that there's some attenuation when you look at the changes in rent sharing coefficients over longer and shorter time periods. And we're getting a coefficient of around 0.13. But again, we're seeing that basically everything's driven by the central tendency of profitability in the covered firms. Okay, next we're going to go on to this question of how am I doing for time, Ellora? I don't have a clock.
You're good. You're just a few minutes from your 10-minute warning. So.
Oh, okay, perfect. So now what we're going to do is we're going to look at how changes in cushions respond to changes in negotiated floors. And the way we're going to do this is for each worker, we can see their components of their wage before the new contract comes in. And then we can see the change in floors that is mandated by their contract. That's what we're going to call delta F, delta f. Okay, so that's the percentage change in the wage floor. And so what we're going to do is we're going to simulate for you how much your wage would go up if all that happened is that your floor was incremented by the amount that the contract says it should be incremented. In other words, if your cushion and supplements all held constant, okay? And we're going to call that delta W star. Okay, so it's kind of like, and then we're going to run a regression of the actual wage on this simulated wage, and we're going to see whether we get a coefficient of 1 or less than 1. So it's basically what I call this a pass-through regression. So it'd be kind of like when you run a regression of, we've increased the taxes on gasoline by 10%. How much does the price at retail go up? 8%, so is there some offset or not? This is exactly the same kind of idea. And so the coefficient theta 1 in the equation in the middle of the slide here measures the offset, or if there is any offset, by cushions up to the floor. And so if theta 1 is 1, that means that there's no offset on average. If theta 1 was 0, it means there's full offset. And of course, you'd be surprised probably not to know that we're going to get a theta of around 1/2. Okay, so we do a lot of analysis in the paper, and again, in the interest of time, I'm not going to show it, but we were interested in particular in whether there's evidence of a different reaction to changes in your floor. Your floors are decreasing over time if they're not renegotiated because everything's real here and there's some inflation. So we're trying to see, we could see, well, if all that happens is your real wage floor fell because of inflation, do you get any offset in your cushion for that that's different than the offset of the cushion when there's a mandated increase from a renegotiation? And we don't see any evidence of that. There's kind of what we call that as a symmetry test. We also estimate this pass-through coefficient separately by age, education, gender groups. And what we see, I think, which might make sense if you think about it, is we're going to see, I'm going to show you a graph in a second, but we're going to see lower pass-through for high cushion workers. Well, that kind of makes sense. Remember, there's a lot of workers that the cushion isn't very big. So they really can't cut their cushion very much. Now, typical wage increases in our sample period are on the order of 1 to 4%. So it isn't necessarily going to have to be a large adjustment to your cushion in order to offset the mandated increase in the floor. And so there's a lot of workers that could, in principle, get wage cuts that would get rid of at least some of the mandated floor. But so here's the pattern on average. So on the x-axis, we've got the mean wage cushion prior to the recent increase in log points. Each of these diamonds is one of our demographic groups. And then the wage floor pass-through estimated for that group is shown on the y-axis. And you can see there's a downward sloping pattern. But it doesn't go all the way to zero, even for very high wage workers with very high cushions. So there's some spillover or pass-through, you could think of it, but not complete. Okay. So the last thing we do in the paper then is we're going to try and look at, this is kind of like DFL analysis gone crazy. We're going to try and look at how wages evolved between 2010 and 2016. So remember that, again, this is a horrible time in Portugal. So real wages are falling. And there's a bunch of things that can happen, and it can affect how wages vary for different types of workers. So your floor can adjust, your cushion can adjust, your supplements can adjust. And over a 6-year period, you can also lose one job and get another job, so you can be reallocated across floors. And we want to try and figure out how important is that component in particular. So we do a sequence of counterfactual scenarios. So scenario A, we just take workers in 2010 with their actual cushions, floors, supplements, and so on. Scenario B, we take all those workers in 2010. We know how, if they'd stayed in that job, we know how their floor would have increased. Okay, so we then assign them the 2016 floors, but hold everything else constant. So that's a pure measure of the effect of the floor changes over this period, holding constant, which floor you're covered by and your cushion. Scenario C, we reweight everyone to their 2016 demographic components. And so what that does is captures the reallocation of workers between age and education cells. And over this period, average workers in Portugal are becoming more educated quite quickly. And other things equal, that would have increased wages quite substantially. Scenario D, now what we want to do is we've got sort of everybody with the new floors, but we're holding them back in their original collective bargaining agreement and our original cushion. Now we want to give them their new collective bargaining agreement. And the way we do that is we take the workers in 2016, okay? We use the 2016 weights, so that means that we got the demographic composition of 2016, but we give them, we see them in 2016, we give them the 2010 cushion and supplements that they were getting, okay? So that then captures the reallocation of workers across floors, the difference between scenario C and scenario D. So all we've done in that scenario, we've kind of held constant your cushion and supplement, but we've moved you from the floor group that you were covered by in 2010 to the one you're actually covered by in 2016. And so that's a reallocation effect. Scenario E, we're going to then adjust your cushion from the 2010 to 2016. So that's a reaction of your cushion. And scenario F, we're going to adjust the supplements. Okay, there'll be a test later. Okay, so here's the table of sort of the summary of the results. So column 1 says this is the relative wage floor for these different groups on average in log points. So the relative wage floor is around 27 log points, cushions around 20 log points, supplements around 17 log points. This is all, remember, this is all relative to the minimum wage. Column 5 says, well, what happened to the total wage in real terms in this period, period 2010, 2016? Well, on average, for all workers in the economy, it fell by 1.7 log points. It fell a little bit more for men, 2.2 log points, than women, basically 0. It fell a lot more for highly educated workers. So it fell by 16 log points for university educated workers, 12 or 13 log points for high school educated workers, but only 2 log points for less educated workers. Remember, that's the largest group. And by age, it didn't fall much at all for young workers. Of course, that kind of makes sense if you think about it, because people that are only 16 to 24 in Portugal, they're basically not finished education yet. So that's only going to be less educated young workers, most of whom are getting very close to the minimum wage. So there's very little leverage for them. did fall more for the older workers. And one group for whom there was very small adjustment was older women with less than a high school education. So 25 to 40, well, not that old, I guess, central age women, much younger than me, 25 to 44, less than high school. So they're basically flat. Now here's the components of that are in the columns over here. So column 6 is a change in wage floors. So just take these workers in 2010, see what happened to their floors. On average, it's about a 2.2 percentage point reduction, much bigger for university educated guys. Then the reweighting across skill groups. So this is the effect of demographic change. That's plus 7 points. Okay, so that's showing this amazing increase in education and aging out of a lot of older workers that didn't have high school education. Within the cells, that doesn't do anything very much because they're mostly, for a university, for instance, it does a little bit, but not very much because there's just an age component there. The reallocation to new floors is a fairly big component. So that's going minus 4.8% on average, and a huge negative effect for the better educated groups. So they basically, the new jobs that are opening up for better educated workers are in sectors that have lower wage floors. Okay, so there's basically a de-skilling going on. University educated workers are going down the job ladder into crappier jobs. The change in cushions within the floor group is a minus 2.5 percentage points. And again, there isn't much room for that to adjust for the lowest group people because their cushions are relatively small. But for the better educated workers, it's there's some room there, and that's also falling for, especially for the university educated. And then the change in supplements are basically a wash. Those basically stay very constant. So if you put all the pieces together, you can see here's the components. And there's a kind of an interesting offset. The demographic gains plus 7 are basically offset by the reductions in all the other components. And so on average, the reduction in floors in real terms, the reduction in cushions and the reduction and the reallocation effects together would have dropped wages by 8 or 9 points. Instead, because there's a very rapid increase in education, that's offsetting that somewhat. For the highest educated university group, there's big losses across the board. And so this is a summary of kind of how things look. This is the mean log wage of a group, and these are age, education, gender cells, okay? And each age, education, gender cell is represented on this graph by a combination of 5 dots, okay? So here's the highest education group. This is like male university, older people. So what happened to them? Well, their supplements didn't change. So the supplements you can see are constant across the graph here. The floor updating for them is lowering their wages about 5 percentage points. And you can see the floor updating is this set of diamonds, and it's basically kind of got a downward slope and then flattens out. The adjustment of cushions kind of looks the same. So they're both reductions. The reallocation effect here is really large for these better paid workers. All the new jobs are in crappier positions. And then the overall change is here. So that you can kind of see how this is working descriptively. Okay, then to summarize, what do we find in this paper? Well, the main thing that I hope people would realize that if you're thinking about European collective bargaining agreements, you should really think of the collective bargaining agreement wages as minimum wages, not like they are in the United States where you're setting a wage for jobs. A typical worker has a wage cushion of around 20%, so there's variation for that to be cut or to increase in better economic times. Wage floors within an agreement move in lockstep, and seem to react to the average conditions of firms in the sector. There's about 50% pass-through of wage increases from floors into actual wages that workers receive in the period we're studying, at least. And over this period of severe recession, real wages fell due to basically all 3 components of real wage floor changes going down, real cushions being lowered, and reallocation, particularly for higher educated workers. So that means that despite heavy collective bargaining coverage in Portugal, there was quite a bit of flexibility in wages. So this is what this is what the German economists wanted Portugal to do. They wanted their real wages to fall, and they did, even though there was pretty extensive collective bargaining agreement coverage, and most floors didn't change that much. The combination of reallocation and cushion reductions helped lower wages. So I'll stop sharing there and turn it over.
Great. Thanks very much, Dave. So that was fantastic. We're going to have Dube discussing this.
Great. Thanks very much. Can people hear me okay? All right, excellent. So this was just a really fascinating paper. And, one of the interesting things is that, as Dave was saying, the US context is really different and unique, but a lot of the ways we think about unions are often driven by a US bias, perhaps. So really just getting a basic understanding of how do sectoral bargaining work seems really important. And this paper really makes major contribution and progress in helping understand some of those. I really like the way of decomposing the wage, the base wage, into the minimum plus floor plus cushion. That's a very useful decomposition. So here I'm going to just highlight what I see as some of the key contributions and some implications along the way, and some questions as they come up. So one is that cushions matter, like Dave said, that these are minimum wages set throughout the distribution and beyond which firms actually raise wages further, called cushions. So one interesting thing is just to think about, when do cushions actually, when are they larger, when are they smaller? And so I think that's going to be, that paper sheds some light along those dimensions. One thing that I thought was quite interesting if you do this variance decomposition is that there's actually a small positive covariance between the floor and the cushions, and that seems to mostly be picking up worker type differences, because within groups, for example, within the higher educated group, it's actually a negative covariance, if anything. So this is probably reflecting that, because one could imagine that if an exogenous increase in the floor, the cushions are smaller, as in fact the paper shows. So that's sort of the causal part versus just the sorting part. But the other thing, which is sort of, maybe I would highlight this even more because perhaps I didn't know necessarily what the answer was, is do floors actually matter higher up in the distribution? One could think that maybe in collective bargaining, lower and middle wage jobs are really where unions really focus on having binding floors. But here it's clear that floors are actually binding throughout the distribution. So it's not like floor at a 80th percentile type job is just a pro forma number that is not binding anywhere. So it's all cushions above and it's all floors below. And that's not the case. It seems there are actually binding floors throughout the distribution, which I found it interesting. I didn't have a prior on it, but I could see it going either way. So I learned that in fact the floors matter throughout, which is interesting. Another thing that comes up a lot, as Dave said, that there's a sneaking suspicion that essentially collective bargaining sometimes is used to drive out competitors. You hear this actually even in current context, like did Amazon raise wages to drive out its competitors? That's one possibility. So here it's really interesting to see that in fact what seems to guide the floors is the central tendency, not necessarily those above. If anything, so I actually, this is from the appendix, that there's sort of a horse race type thing here. You can sort of see if you allow for both the mean and another percentile, there's a 10th percentile here, there's a 90th percentile here. If anything, if there's some excess sensitivity, it's to the bottom, not the top, which I thought was interesting. And again, in principle, one could see arguments, political economy type arguments, why you could see pressures from both top and bottom, but certainly doesn't seem to be the case that the top is putting pressure. And I wonder to what extent that is because of the presence of cushions, because high productivity firms can just raise their wages. They don't have to abide by the floor, so they may not bother putting pressure to raise the floor, so which is an interesting issue where you have that cushion is allowed versus not allowed. there's also productivity pass-through from the for productivity of the floor. And here, I thought it was interesting. It was a pass-through about there's a rent sharing elasticity rather of about 0.1. And this is at an industry level. So I actually thought, like, compared to the few things in the literature at the industry level, it seems a little on the smaller end, if anything. I know because a lot of the firm level ones are, sort of in that range. So one could have expected the industry level for, shock to be greater, but the rent sharing elasticity to be greater, but that wasn't the case. So that was interesting. And then this is another, so along the lines what Dave said, for instance, when the floor rises, there's a pass through of floor to base wages at 0.5. I also found that, and sort of the other side of that is that there's this possible spillover effects, right? That sort of tapers off. Again, this version of the figure I found very, very nice and compelling, of showing how basically as a function of the lagged cushion, how the pass-through coefficient varies, and you can sort of see that sort of tapering off, the biggest being on the bottom. And one interesting thing, which is generally true here in the minimum wage context, is what determines the extent of spillover. So there are reasons to believe that some of the spillovers are due to fairness concerns or relative wage rankings, and others, there's also, you get spillovers along the wage distribution from a monopsonic, sort of market competition type reasons. So I wonder if there's something to be done here to sort of see, shedding light on when you actually see greater extent of spillovers, depending on the nature of the firm. One thing that Dave didn't mention is they also have this effect of using the analysis that they did, the causal analysis of the wage on the pass-through, also to look at the impact of of the floor on employment. And I would be remiss if I didn't talk about the own wage elasticity report, which the estimate, which they very helpfully reported, which was a positive 0.3 with the confidence interval between negative 0.36 and 0.96, which very much, of course, is in the range of a lot of current estimates in the minimum wage literature. One thought that I did have for that analysis is, because it's using this cross-firm variation, to the extent that you do see some reallocation between the firms that are most impacted by this floor versus not. So if you have reallocation of employment between firms, of course, that's going to tend to possibly bias the estimates for the reasons of reallocation that, for example, Ihsaan and co-authors cite. So just in the last few minutes, just a few stray thoughts and suggestion. And one question that, I often hear or sometimes hear is just, are floors sometimes ceilings? Like, sometimes can floors be used to essentially focus on or collude to keep wages from rising? That one may have thought that higher wages, and because there's this wage compression effect, are actually pulled down. And here, I wonder if cushions effectively are a way to deter collusive wage reduction and compression, where essentially when firms can, after they leave the table, they can then set their own wage for the higher end people. Maybe that makes it harder to collude. I'm not sure, but that seems interesting. Another question is, when do cushions vary more? For example, are cushions larger in a more competitive market, in a competitive labor market? Are cushions smaller? So what does sort of the degree of monopsony power, if you will, do to the distribution of cushions? That seemed an interesting thing. Would be also nice to get a sense of how the cushions relate to sort of the firm wage policies for the work that David and co-authors have done so much on. Just one example is, are high cushion firms largely high skill firms because of sorting, or are they high wage firms in the AKM fixed effect sense? Or it seemed like the evidence from the value added per worker decile suggests they could be both. It would be nice to get a sense of the sort of the cushion firm effect, joint distribution would be kind of nice. One last point is just in trying to get a better handle on the causal effect, which I really appreciated the firm level analysis. One issue, of course, as I mentioned with the firm level analysis, is if you have the spillovers across firms within the same local labor market, I wonder, could there be maybe for future projects using sort of the regional variation of BITE along, of course, David's own work from back when on minimum wages, but also in the Discussants et al. Paper using the BITE of the minimum wage in Germany. What about finding local labor markets in Portugal where the floors are more or less binding? I'm assuming that they're national floors. I could be wrong. If they're local, then that wouldn't play, but then a different strategy is possibly available. But the idea then is to sort of see what do floors do by comparing local labor markets with different amounts of BITEs for those wages. So anyway, so those are some thoughts. Really appreciated and learned a lot from the paper, and glad to see it was done. So thanks, everyone.
Okay, great. Thanks for that excellent discussion, Aaron. And I think following on this discussion of collective bargaining and how it intersects with the AKM literature, that's a nice segue to this last paper. So I'll hand it over to Lorenzo, and then Heather Sarsons will discuss. And do continue to use the chat. I think there's some interesting discussions there, and I'll try to leave a couple minutes at the end for audience discussion.
Hi, everyone. Can you see my slides? Perfect. Okay. So I'm very excited to be here, very excited to present this work. This was actually work that was first presented in the Summer Institute, got excellent discussion by Suresh. So we changed a lot of stuff around, and we hope you really like it and get some excellent discussion from Heather Sarsons. So this joint work with Ellora, Derenoncourt, François, Gerard, and Claire Montialoux, and it's a project on collective bargaining, earnings, and inequality. So we know that estimating the causal effects of unions on earnings is actually quite difficult. So on one hand, simply worker selection into union jobs could be biasing estimates of union premiums, especially if this selection is on observables. On the other hand, something that's maybe not as commonly discussed is that there are establishment-specific factors that may be confounding union effects, especially if unionization is at the establishment level, and given the growing evidence that there's a wage-setting component of firms, it's hard to disentangle how much comes from the union, how much comes from factors, unobserved factors about the establishment. Some identification strategies, like the use of close union elections that are, comparing comparable establishments that are either unionized or not, get around this issue. But there are also some problems with that type of identification strategy, such as manipulation around the cutoff. Now, regardless of these concerns, the evidence, at least from the US, is quite indicative that unionized workers are earning a premium on their earnings, and that unions / the collective bargaining process is reducing inequality. Now, the evidence from developing countries is actually a bit more mixed. And in some cases, there are some papers that have shown dissimilar compression, but others have actually indicated that there's a dispersion in earnings. And this could be due to weaker enforcement. It could also be due to, as was mentioned before, the presence of the informal sector. But one factor that kind of could contribute to this mixed results, but also would be very interesting to explore, even in the case of the US and other contexts with strong enforcement, is that not all unions are the same. So the individual union premiums are likely heterogeneous. And to the extent that we can dig deeper into that, we can understand more about sort of where unions are negotiating and the contribution of the union factors to inequality. So in this paper, what we do is we ask, how do unions affect inequality and earnings gaps through the negotiation of collective bargaining agreements, or CBAs? So we're specifically going to focus on the unions affecting earnings through collective bargaining agreements. There could be other factors that Ihsaan discussed, for example, like the threat of strikes that could be influencing this, but we're specifically going to focus on CBAs. And we're going to study this in the context of Brazil. So we started in South Africa, went to Portugal, now we're going to be in the context of Brazil. Brazil is a country that has really pervasive inequality, but also very strong union presence. Over 50% of private formal workers are covered by some CBAs, but it's also a very highly decentralized structure. We have over 11,000 unions that are participating in the collective bargaining process, which is a huge amount. And we have very nice data. It's administrative linked employer-employee data that is going to be matched to a registry of CBAs, essentially the universe of CBAs. And this is going to give us some time variation in coverage. Using this very nice data, what we'll do is we're going to estimate the union premiums by using an augmented AKM approach. So we're going to rely on worker mobility across establishments, as in the traditional AKM, to separately identify worker and establishment effects. And then added to that, the augmented part of it, we're going to use the gaps in coverage from the CBAs to estimate union-specific coverage effects. So that is the premium and earnings that workers that are covered by a specific union obtain. So, main contribution here is that we're going to be estimating the full distribution of union premiums in Brazil. And actually what we'll find is that most unions, at least through this channel of negotiating collective bargaining agreements, are going to have a limited impact on earnings. So for low educated workers, the premium is on average of 3 log points. So smaller than, union premiums tend to be estimated around 15 to 10 log points in other settings. But this is going to mask a lot of heterogeneity across unions. So we'll find, for example, that high premium unions tend to be negotiating at low paying establishments. So this is in one sense in which they contribute to compression, the fact that the union that is actually kind of increasing wages the most are negotiating at establishments that are actually paying their workers low wages. We'll find that some unions are compressing the earnings gap in education. So comparing low to high educated workers, the low educated workers are getting higher premiums than the high educated workers. And we'll actually find that the unions that are affiliated to combative union centrals, so think of this as kind of like unions that are more on the integrated to the left-leaning political parties in Brazil, are the ones that are actually contributing more to this compression. So there's one of the different features, that there are others we would like to explore that are correlated with higher compression. And on average, when you think of the average union is increasing the relative pay of low educated workers relative to high educated workers by 6 log points. But not everyone is being covered by the average union, so the effect that we see in the overall economy is going to be lower. So there's interesting patterns that we'll be able to explore of like where workers work and where unions negotiate that affect the overall effect. Okay, so in today's talk, first I'll talk a little bit about the context in Brazil, then I'll present our augmented AKM approach to estimating the union premiums. And then we'll go through the 2 main results, which is going to be the decomposition of the variance, and then the decomposition of the gap, the earnings gap by education groups, and then we'll explore the premiums, the union premium heterogeneity. Okay, so in Brazil, about 50% of the private formal workers are covered by some collective bargaining agreement, and most of this coverage comes from sectoral CBAs that are negotiated between individual unions or groups of unions and employer associations. So as in the context of Portugal, the firms are grouped into employer associations based on industry, and then these employer associations as a unit negotiate with unions, and then coverage is assigned to the workers in that industry. But in Brazil, you also have some firm level CBAs that are negotiated between unions and firms. This provides some additional coverage, but most of it comes from the sectoral agreements. Now, coverage is universal. So you don't have to be a member of a union in order to be covered, essentially, as long as you're working, if you're represented by a given union based on where you work, then you're covered by that CBA. But workers can pay additional union membership fees that give them some additional perks that are non-related to collective bargaining agreements. So, for example, there could be union-sponsored private health insurance plans. There could be access to a fitness center from the union, or some recreational center. So that membership is separate from coverage. That's kind of what I want to emphasize here. Informal workers can become members, and essentially a worker can become a member of any union, but informal workers in particular are not covered by the CBAs. And we have a as mentioned before, a very fragmented union structure with over 11,000 unions that are participating. Some of these are affiliated to National Union Central, so we're going to jump into that at the end when we explore heterogeneity. But the National Union Central, like an umbrella organization that coordinates, among several things, that coordinates kind of bargaining activities across unions that are from different industries. So there can be unions from the metal workers and the bankers and service workers that are affiliated to a particular union central, and the union central holds like annual congresses to coordinate activities across these different unions. So the data we'll be using, so to observe coverage, which is kind of one of the nice things that sort of we've added based on my job market paper, is going to be using the linked employee data, which is known as HISE, and then we're going to merge in the registry of all CBAs in Brazil. And we're going to assign coverage based on basically whether the given establishment is in the geographic coverage and in signing this agreement. And with this, we'll be able to observe December hourly earnings for all workers and the CBA coverage. And the time period we have is 2009 to 2017. We're going to focus on restrict our sample to private sector prime age workers that are on open-ended non-farm contracts that paid on a monthly basis. For membership, we observe membership in the household survey, which is known as PENAGE. We have a longer time period there. But the important thing that I want to highlight here is that in the PENAGE, we do observe informal sector. So HISE is restricted to the formal sector. So most of the analysis, actually all the analysis I'll present today is going to be focusing on the formal sector. But I will mention here that when we take coverage and kind of map that into like industry, geography, cells in PENAGE, where we do observe informality, we do observe that the informal workers are actually getting higher wages or higher earnings when let's say the coverage density is higher in where they work. So something to indicate that perhaps there are some spillovers even to the informal sector. Okay, so just briefly about what's been happening in Brazil over the past few years. On the left-hand side, you have the coverage rates, and on the right-hand side, you have the membership rates from PENAGE. Coverage is obviously outpacing membership rates, as is the case in most settings that have universal coverage. So coverage is around 50%, union density or membership is around 20, but both statistics are kind of declining over time, indicating the declining scope of the influence of unions in Brazil. Okay, so let's jump into, I think, our methodological addition to the literature. So traditionally, when we think of how to estimate union premiums, is usually done through a Manserian regression, where you're regressing earnings, log earnings or wages on a set of observed covariates, and then you add a dummy for being a union member or being covered by a CBA, and then interpret that ADA as a premium, wage premium from being in a union. So this does not account for sorting on unobservables into unions, and as mentioned in the introduction, there could also be important confounding effects coming from establishment factors that are hard to disentangle from the union effects. Bassier and Sarsons in their QJE paper, they leverage contract expiration in Wisconsin to estimate the effects on gender earnings gaps for teachers. And in some sense, we're going to do something a similar exercise where we're leveraging, rather than expiration of contracts, we're going to leverage the gaps in CBA coverage by establishment to then estimate union-specific premiums, and then how these premiums affect earnings inequality. So what is our augmented AKM approach? So as in the original sort of traditional AKM, we're going to use worker mobility across establishments to estimate worker and establishment fixed effects. And at the same time, we're going to estimate these union-specific coverage effects, the effect that these have on earnings, by using gaps in CBA coverage within establishment over time. So essentially, our model now is going to have log earnings being explained by a worker fixed effect, alpha I, an establishment fixed effect, psi j, where this index function j is telling you where worker I is working time t. And then kind of the factor we're adding here is this union fixed effect, eta u, which is going to be active in the years of coverage. So this is essentially going to be the years when the union is renegotiating terms for the establishment. So it's important that there's the union that's covering all workers in establishment J, and it's going to be time varying. That's why we have the additional T subscript here, because it's going to be essentially active when the negotiation takes place. And then we have some time varying covariates included in the regression as well. So this exercise, as in the traditional IKM, is assuming a unique job ladder that is common among all workers. The identification requirements, as emphasized before, we need a connected set of establishments with respect to worker flows. We're going to focus on the largest connected set available to us in all of Brazil. And then the additional requirement is that we need unions with coverage gaps in at least one of the covered establishments. So a union could be negotiating and agreements that cover different establishments. We need it to be the case that at least in one of those establishments, there is a gap in coverage such that we can separately identify the psi, the establishment fixed effect from the union fixed effects. Now, to get unbiased estimates, the important condition here, as traditional AKM, would be an exogenous mobility condition. That is that since we were identifying off of movers, we need it to be the case that these movers are not moving due to factors that are not included in our model that are then correlated to earnings. Added assumption is that also this sort of the years where there is no coverage or the places where there is no coverage are also don't have these unobserved factors that are correlated with earnings. So once we have all these estimates, it's important to think of how to interpret them. So for the establishment fixed effect, you can think of that as the pay premium of establishment J relative to a competitive or a zero rent industry. In our case, we'll use the restaurant sector. And the ETAs, is the union fixed effects, are the pay premiums of a specific unions relative to no coverage. So essentially, we're omitting the ETA of the years of no coverage. Okay, so the first thing we can do with this type of framework is to decompose the variance of log earnings into the contribution of these different fixed effects. So directly the variance of the worker establishment and union fixed effects. But also interestingly, we're going to be able to explore what's happening in the covariances. So here emphasized in kind of the green, this covariance is telling you sort of whether high skilled workers are sorting or are more likely to be at high or low paying firms, whether these high skilled workers are actually ending up working or being covered by high or low premium unions. And then this last one is telling you whether the high premium unions are more likely to be negotiating at low or high paying firms. So this is regarding variance. We could also care about gaps. So the most important gap, at least if you're thinking about, this general evidence that there's compression from unions, would be the gap by education. So high and low education workers could be sorting into high or low premium unions. And depending on where they are, they may be experiencing different within union gaps. So if we estimate this model or these premiums by education group, we can then decompose these between group earnings gap into a sorting and pay gap effects, as has been done previously, in Cardoso and Klein's paper in Portugal regarding the gender gap, and other work also with François, Gerard, Severnini, Card, and myself on racial gaps in Brazil. You can take this gap is basically explained by all the components in our model. And what we're gonna sort of add here, now we're gonna see how much of this gap is explained by the difference in union premiums. And we can decompose that into a sorting and a pay gap effect. The sorting one being that it could be the case that the high educated workers are more likely to work at high or low paying establishments. Sorry,
10-minute warning.
I saw it. Thank you, Laura. High or low paying premium unions, and that the other component could be that the premiums for the high or low education workers could be different. So there could be some compression or dispersion from here. that's contributing to this gap. We could do this at the establishment level or at the union level, and we're going to show both, but they're essentially the same. Okay, so let's jump into results. Okay, so here I'm going to first in column 1, we're showing the traditional AKM that excludes the union fixed effects. Column 2 is including the union fixed effects. You'll first note that the goodness of fit is actually almost identical between both models. And then what we'll focus on is on this part of the table, which is telling you what percentage of the variance in log earnings is due to the direct like variance components of these fixed effects, and then the covariances. So you'll note that the worker effects are essentially unchanged, essentially because adding the union fixed effect is only affecting what occurs for the establishment fixed effect. The first thing we want to emphasize is that accounting for unions, so moving from column 1 to column 2, increases establishment's role in pay inequality. So we're now accounting for 23% rather than 17%. The sort of positive assortative matching of workers to high-paying establishments lowers slightly, but taken together, you essentially see that establishments, in terms of their contribution to inequality, is increasing, which is something quite interesting to note, that in other settings where these AKM models have been estimated, and where there's also high union presence, that we could actually be under thinking about the role of that the actual establishment has in pay setting. Now, the union matters, at least directly through the variance, contributes 6%. But interestingly, we find that high premium unions are negotiating at low paying establishments. And this covariance contribution is negative and large, to the extent that taking both together, you're seeing a negative contribution to the variance, so that some compression or a reduction in the variance essentially due to unions. And then finally, there seems to be very little worker selection into unions. So this seems to matter very little. So whether high school workers are working or selecting into higher low paying unions doesn't seem to contribute much to the variance. So now we do the same model for both separately for the largest connected set of high school workers and those without a high school degree. As expected, higher dispersion for high education workers with higher means. So what we find by comparing these two columns, worker effects, you can think of this as skill, are playing a much bigger role for earnings of the high educated workers that contribute much more directly to sort of this dispersion. You also see that the positive assortative matching of high school workers to high paying establishments is much larger. And even though the sorting of workers to unions is also low, it's still higher. So whereas skill broadly defined matters most for the high educated group, for a low educated group, what matters more is basically where you work. The establishment component is higher, and even though this kind of positive assortative matching is not really contributing as much, overall the sum of the two is higher among the low educated workers. And then not only establishment, but the union effect also is now directly, it's contributing much more. It matters more directly, but this negative selection of like the high premium unions going to low paying establishment is much more important, meaning that in the end, you get much higher within group compression of wages for the low educated workers and for the high educated workers. So what's interesting here is that here we're just discussing within group kind of compression and thinking about the variance, but what is happening to the average between these two groups, and is there any sort of sorting across the groups that we should take into account? So that's what we kind of do by looking at the dual connected set of these two. So basically the intersection of these two largest connected sets. We can then look at the overall earnings gap, which is 29 log points, and how much of it is attributed to the different gaps of our fixed effects. So essentially, most of it, about 75%, is due to observables and unobserved worker characteristics. And the remainder is mostly where people are working, the establishment effects, and almost nothing, like nearly zero, negative 1% of this gap is due to unions, right? So it seems that on average, the unions are not doing much. The interesting thing they're not doing much in reducing this gap. The interesting thing is when we do the decomposition. So when we do the decomposition, even though we have unions playing a limited role here, we see that there is actually the relative pay setting effect is negative and would be sort of reducing this gap by 4%. That is that in establishments, on average, where people are working, the premium for the low educated workers is higher. But this negative effect is offset or almost offset completely by worker sorting. The fact that across these groups, the high educated workers end up working and being at establishments that end up negotiating with higher paying unions. And some of this you could think is due to kind of, this sample has a lot of establishments that are never covered by a CBA. But if we focus on those that are always covered, now the gap in union effects would reduce this higher gap by 3%. But you again see a similar pattern where there's, even though you have a higher compression among these set of establishments, the sorting is also more important and kind of dampens that effect. Okay, so let's think about these gaps and how these gaps, this here sort of compression within that attributed to the union, how is that heterogeneous across unions, and are there things that we observe that kind of correlate with that would be interesting to think about further. So here, what we're showing is the observations now are the individual unions. In our largest connected set, we have, in this dual connected set, we have 4,000, almost 5,000 unions that we can estimate these premiums for. And we're doing that, showing the sort of the kernel density for the high education premiums versus the low education premiums. Now, we again see a limited impact on earnings. So for the interquartile range for the low educated specific union premiums are between -2 log points and 5 log points. Large masses kind of around 0. On average, the union is compressing earning, the average union is compressing, are essentially paying the low education workers 6 log points more than the high education workers. Now, one of the interesting things that might be as we mentioned, that this 6% is not as, it's not observed in our sample because it's not the case that you're always facing the average union. You could be not covered where the gap is 0 by definition, or you could be basically more likely to be covered by unions that don't compress earnings by a lot. So one of the first exercises we have done, and we're thinking about doing more exercises, is to think about this separation between combative and cooperative union centrals. So these umbrella organizations, there are 9 of them in Brazil, main one of them being CUT and Força Sindical, can be separated into combative versus cooperative union centrals in the sense that the ones on the left, which are the combative ones, tend to have red and have squared logos. Those tend to arise from this movement of new unionism. They were sort of more likely to enter conflict with employers. They were also instrumental in kind of the end of the military dictatorship in Brazil. Whereas the ones on the right, they're kind of more focused on the results unionism, where they're more likely to cooperate with workers. They, for example, favored privatizations. These are the ones on the right. And then unions affiliate to these different types of union centrals. And then we want to see whether these there's heterogeneity in how they compress the gap by education groups. So what I'm showing here is essentially separately for combative in green and cooperative, and those that are unaffiliated, the mean union premium for low education on the x-axis, mean for high education on the y-axis, and sort of the tone is essentially indicating how many unions are there. So most unions in the combative side are CUT. There are very few in CTB and CGTB, whereas in the cooperative, you have kind of a lot in Força Sindical, but also a lot in these other two. What we see is essentially the combative ones tend to be more to the right, so they pay higher premiums for low education workers, and further down in the y-axis, so less or larger negative premiums to educated workers. And on average, we see higher compression for these combative unions, negative 6.3 versus a negative 5.1 for the cooperative. The unaffiliated actually have a larger compression, but these are actually very few. This is 15% of all unions. Okay, so just to wrap up in the last minute, you know what, I think essentially the main contribution we have thus far is that we're able to estimate the union-specific premiums for thousands of unions. Each union has a separate premium. And the approach we use is non-augmented AKM that is leveraging these gaps in union coverage over time within establishments. I think one of the nice things that actually was brought up in discussion by Aaron was that we find that high premium unions are actually negotiating at low-paying establishments. And on average, we find that there are greater premiums for low relative to high education workers, which is expected and kind of goes along with previous findings in the literature. But we do find kind of interesting sorting patterns that end up kind of affecting the overall contribution that unions have in the economy of Brazil. We find that unions vary in their ability to reduce this gap. The first thing we found is that combative union centrals are associated with this higher compression. But in future work, we want to think about sort of which clauses in the CBAs are more related to compression. So, you know, we initially had thought about this project while thinking about wage floors directly. But since we have the entire text of the CBAs, maybe we could see whether there are other attributes that are contributing to that compression. So thank you so much. And I'll stop sharing and let Heather take over.
Thanks, Lorenzo. Yeah, Heather, take it away.
It says host disabled participant screen sharing. I was probably supposed to log in through something else.
Okay, let me try to fix that. Working on it.
Oh, perfect. Thank you. Okay, great. Yeah, so thanks so much for the opportunity to discuss this paper. I'm a big fan of all the author's work, so this is really a privilege to be able to talk about this project. So just the quick kind of standard overview. I think this is a really ambitious project aiming to quantify the impact that unions have on earnings inequality kind of across the entire Brazilian economy. So there's a lot of descriptive evidence on this topic, largely kind of, you know, in the US and in other countries, but as the authors note, it's really difficult to get at this question causally to kind of estimate directly the impact of unionization on earnings inequality. So most of the causal estimates we have come from specific sectors or occupations, with some more recent exceptions. But I think the authors are taking on a really big question and getting at it in a really unique way by using this new kind of AKM style approach to estimate the impact of unionization by looking at these lapses in the collective bargaining agreements and kind of being able to account for sorting of workers across establishments and so on. So overall, they find that kind of pay inequality across these establishments would have been even larger in the absence of these unions. And they find some really interesting heterogeneity based on, you know, kind of the education of workers and so on. So I kind of just have kind of one big comment and then a couple of smaller ones. And so the larger one is just kind of thinking a bit more about the identification strategy. And here I think it would just be helpful to have a bit more background on kind of when and why these lapses occur. So I think this is kind of what you were talking about when you talked about the exogeneity of these gaps in the CBAs. And so my understanding is you kind of want to get at the impact of unionization on earnings inequality. And I think the one question that came to my mind is having a lapse in a CBA kind of the same thing as not being unionized? And so just a bit more information on how often these lapses occur, how long they are, and why they happen, I think would be very useful. We could think that these lapses occur in particular when there's conflict between unions and employers, maybe when there's an economic downturn and so on. And so you could think that these kinds of things might be correlated with workers' wages in certain establishments or in certain firms. So I understand you're kind of looking at a union specific effect, but this could be kind of correlated with other things that are going on between firms and unions at that time. And kind of depending on why these are occurring, you might be getting an underestimate if, for example, it's happening when workers' wages are particularly low and they can't come to an agreement or something like that. So I'm not sure kind of why these lapses occur, but it would be great to just kind of have more information on that to kind of understand whether you're maybe potentially getting an underestimate or an overestimate or what. I also just had a couple of questions kind of on the interpretation. So this is just kind of a snapshot from your slides of, I think, kind of, yeah, one of the main results. So you find this kind of limited impact on earnings. So, you know, this is for workers without a high school diploma, I believe. You can see the interquartile range going kind of covering 0. But on average, when you look overall, you see this compression between high and low skill or high education and low education workers. And so it wasn't clear to me without kind of understanding how many of the workers are in the bucket of not having a high school diploma and which do have a high school diploma or above, kind of what this means for worker welfare overall. So this could be kind of driven, if there's kind of fewer workers who don't have a high school diploma, then this could mean that workers who do have a high school diploma and above are kind of actually being made worse off. I would be surprised if that's the case, but I believe this number is kind of looking at the difference in the average impact of high and low skill workers or high education, low education workers. And so I think it would be good to just kind of know how many workers are in each of these buckets, because I think it has a pretty different implication for how we interpret these results, whether it's actually that the workers are actually being made a little bit worse off, which again, I would find pretty surprising, or if it's that, yeah, some workers are better off and then some are worse off and so on. I also wasn't sure if you can use other estimation strategies. I mean, I guess we're not really supposed to use diff and diff anymore from what I have seen on the internet, but looking at like the expiration of these CBAs just by doing a diff and diff to just kind of validate some of your estimates might be just a nice kind of double check on that. But if the lapses are sufficiently short and so on, then I see that wouldn't really be feasible. Yeah, and finally, I think I'm just very interested to see kind of where the project goes. It seems like you guys have a ton of interesting data to work with. I think what you mentioned at the end about kind of where you're going, looking at the text of the CBA sounds really fascinating. But looking at kind of inequality between other groups by race or gender, kind of based on Lorenzo's other really interesting work, whether there's heterogeneity based on the leadership of unions, kind of thinking about whose interests are represented in terms of the high and the low education workers and so on, would be a really interesting direction to go, as well as whether there's kind of a sectoral or firm level CBA, kind of how that affects your estimates and so on. Yeah, so overall, I think it's a really fascinating project, and I'm excited to see kind of where you go next with it.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Heather. And thank you to all of the presenters and discussants. This was a really great session. I'm going to leave the room. The recording will stop. I'm going to leave the room open for about 5 minutes in case people want to have any organic discussion. But otherwise, thanks so much, everyone, for coming. And again, to the panelists for their participation.